To you. There goes the recording. Good day to you. Glad to be part of this again. As Georgia was just mentioning, I've had the honor and privilege of presenting several sessions for the Arrowhead Area Agency on Aging. And it's just a treat to be able to do that. And hope some of you might have been part of the earlier sessions. Just a reminder of those topics because they overlap in some ways with the session today. We began working with managers in various programs around loss, distress, burnout, personal and collective responses, and they did a variation of that with staff and with community partners because of the burnout that many people are experiencing given the pandemic, the racial reckoning, and then that was even before all that's going on now in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Then we followed up with a session on storying and restoring elders and their narratives, the importance of stories throughout our lives. And then the third topic was it's possible to not communicate and just helping one another talk about tough stuff, some of the kind of subjects that can be off limits or difficult to talk about at times. And then we're wrapping up the series with the intersections of the personal and the professional and looking at aging services and ambiguity. So that's a lot. And thanks again for being a part of these sessions. Because this one is in some ways the most personal of all, any of the topics could have been for any one of us, but this one makes it quite overt. I would urge us to be gentle with ourselves and with one another as we work together today, because there may be things that we talk about that are hard things for us to face, hard things for us to discern. We may struggle with what we call transference and countertransference because most of us have aging persons in our lives. We ourselves may be aging. And so lots of the topics that you're addressing can be quite personal. So be gentle with your neighbors if they happen to be coping in a different way than you are as we go forward. We do have people of differing abilities participating today, and so let's be conscious of that. Interpreters will be available for those who need that service, and you may see them as well as my face or yours as we go on. Just to give you a preview, I want this to be engaging of you. As Georgia said, if you are eating lunch, even now as we meet, do that. We don't want you to faint because you didn't get proper food at the midday. We won't ask you to share it as if we were in the same room. So do that kind of self-care. We will do a polling question and just 3 or 4 slides. There will be at least one breakout group, perhaps 2 in the session, so that you get to have a conversation with one another. And then throughout, if you have clarifying questions, go ahead and put those in the chat, and Georgia's going to monitor the chat. And then I'm going to reserve a chunk of time at the end for us to have group discussion. We'll move away from slides, and it will be at that point I would especially encourage you, as well as in the small groups, to put on your videos so that we can see one another and participate as fully as possible. So with that, let me move to the screen sharing. And here we go. So there's my email. I always point that out simply because I've done a number of workshops over the years, and what I hear is that often some people's questions happen about 2 hours or 2 days later, and they wish they'd ask something of the speaker. And so take note, tedbowman71@gmail if you do want to be in contact with me anytime in the future. So let's move on about this subject. An obvious one, both about communication generally, but especially about personal matters, is it's not easy communicating. And the message sent is not always the message received, and that can happen both internally, or as you see in this visual, from one person to another. We can bump into one another, we can misconstrue, we can misinterpret something that is said. The result of that in terms of this subject is that we will have conflict. And conflict can occur when two or more people differ and at least one of them thinks it matters or is more invested in it than another. But conflict can also occur, as I suggested, within us. Our heart and our head might be saying different things, that we even get surprised that our body seems to be reacting to someone else or to a situation, and our body is speaking even before we have words. And so it's important that as we start to look at that conflict involves these competing stories. Neither is necessarily right or wrong, all of the truth, but each story, even those within us, is constructed by our ways of taking in information, interpreting that information. What does the headache mean? What does the dry throat mean? What does it mean that I'm agitated because of something that someone is saying? How am I making conclusions? And how do we begin to weave these stories together? Here's an example. Suppose you came upon someone in the woods, feverishly working to saw down a tree. And you ask, "What are you doing?" "Can't you see?" comes the impatient reply. "I'm sawing down this tree." Well, you look exhausted. "How long have you been at it?" "Over 5 hours. I'm beat. This is hard work." Well, why don't you take a break for a few minutes and sharpen your saw, you inquire. "I'm sure it would go a lot faster." "I don't have time to sharpen my saw," the man said emphatically. "I'm too busy sawing." Think about teamwork. Think about work in the community where someone is just forging on, even in families, to get something done, to respond, to act. And other people are saying, hey, let's take a break, take a breath. I'm sure there's a way that we can do this more efficiently. So just pause, chill for a moment. And so there comes some of the conflicts that can occur. So we're going to move to a polling question related to transference. And so, Gavin, if you'll put up the polling question. So I want you to check any three that while working can be signs that something that is now personal for you as you interact with some people around you. Physical numbness, intense feelings of agitation at the person or family that you are working with, intense feelings of guilt because you're not handling it well because of things that is evoked in your life, overwhelming compassion toward the client, like you should be handling it better, exhaustion, unable to sleep after the session. So if you will, check any of those, three of those that especially happen to you that as a clue that something is going on with you personally. And Gavin will monitor this. We'll let it go for just a moment or two and see which of these seem to stand out. That can be triggers about something going on for us. Looks as if the big one is that we are kind of being hard on ourselves, that we should be able to handle it better. Just our sense of exhaustion. The word that has been used again and again and again during the pandemic is languishing, that we just are exhausted, feeling overwhelmed with so many decisions and wondering what's the right thing to do. That certainly happens in families of caregivers as they are trying to manage the forest and the trees. Then a bit more of where you're having compassion toward the client and know that you've gotten triggered in some way because of that. Interesting, these responses. We'll continue to look at variations of things that trigger or that may cause us to be triggered. So Gavin, if you will take down the question, the poll there, so we can see the slide.
Did that go away for everyone?
It's still up on mine.
Oh, just a minute here. Is it still up?
It's still up. Let's see, I think what I had to do one time was to, oops. Okay, I may need to go away from the screen sharing for a moment to remove that. Hold on. Okay, now back to screen share. Okay, there we are. So what I was asking you with that polling question, it relates to transference, and we're going to get a definition of countertransference in just a moment. But transference is the reliving of past or current interpersonal relationships or experiences in other situations, in current situations. So it is a tool that allows us to bring material of the past into our conscious awareness. Oh, gosh, I thought I was through with that, or I didn't expect that, or, oh, I guess that needs my attention. It's a way to work through issues so that they're not repeated in destructive ways. And it's a way to aid clients to find validation for their stories and to seek restoring that promotes healing. So that's what happens with these ways we get triggered. So another way of asking it has to do with ambiguity. Look at the top, if you will, for just a moment. And I won't ask you to put it in the chat, but do you see a duck or a rabbit at the top under ambiguity? So we may see things differently. There's the way we can get triggered. But part of what is important around this is whose story is being told. Is it the client? Is it the family? Is it the colleague? But which story is being heard? Are you hearing his or her story or your own story? Is the message sent, the message received? Have I listened to understand or to respond, to advise, to rescue, to fix? Have I been diverted into my own story, even inadvertently? Or have I listened to respond? Many counselors do that rather than to understand because they want to move the client along. They only have 50 minutes. They want to make it go well and so on. Let me give you an example of this that happened to me early in my career. I was doing some training of police officers in answering domestic calls. It's one of the most scary calls for police officers because as they go into an apartment or a house, they have no idea if there are guns or knives or other weapons there. They were in full uniform, and we had professional actors and actresses to play the warring household. And often you go in twos so that you can separate the warring household, and they handled it very well. But they were in full uniform. The only thing we had done that day was to take the bullets out of the guns. And within 30 seconds, a minute of the division, the separation of the warring household, one of the police officers was going after the male actor. Without them having any personal history together, the male actor sounded so much like the police officer's drunken father, the father that was drunk in his childhood and was still drunk now in his 50s, would not get sober, even use some of the same idioms that his father used. That was classic countertransference. Whose story was being told, which story was being heard, am I being diverted into my own story? And I had to rush into the scene to help the actor not get hit by the nightstick of the police officer. It's a good thing that it happened in training. I hope that might happen to us today, not that you would hit anybody, but that we might help each other to learn some things about ourselves so that we don't do this in our work. So what are we talking about that can create this kind of transference or countertransference? It often results from losses, refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. The police officer was still agitated and angry and frustrated at the absence of his father. It was as if the bottle was much more important to him than was the father-son relationship. And so think about some of the losses that we can lose, our sense of boundaries, our sense of safety, the relationship that we have as a professional. We can lose, people come to see us and they want easy solutions, and we are helping them to look deeper, and they get agitated with us because they want easy solutions and someone to fix it. And these things can occur. Here's an example in a slide. Stu Farber, who's both a professional but also has been in a group, says, as a patient, I have been amazed at the distance providers keep from my grief and how it is touched, and when it is touched, how quickly they're bound to fixing it. Most of the clinicians are so busy protecting themselves that being with me is not possible. They're moving to respond rather than to sit with him. And so a piece of advice that comes from some of our Quaker colleagues is no fixing, no saving, no advising, no setting each other straight. It's one of the hardest guidelines for those of us in the helping professions, but it's one of the most vital rules if we wish to make a space that welcomes the soul, the inner teacher. And so be cautious about wanting to lift the spirits, say something to make it better, too quickly suggesting a solution is what I call Minnesota cheer up. Rather, are we willing to sit with people in their worst moments, in the midst of some grief or some distress, and be there with them instead of moving too quickly to try to make it a bit better, to lift the spirits in some ways. It's that kind of thing that it can occur. It's well-intentioned, but it's too fast. Barbara Abercrombie, in her book of poems dealing with loss, talks about the language of condolence. No matter how well intended, it irritated me. My husband had not gone to a better place, as if he were off on a holiday. He had not passed like clouds overhead, nor was he my late husband, as if he had missed a train. I had not lost him, as if he had been careless, and for sure, none of us thought it was the best. My husband had died. And then she stands back from that. I knew, of course, that euphemism was offered in kindness and grateful for friends or counselors or aging workers for any attempt to comfort me. I appreciated that, but what I really wanted was the language of hard truth and reality. And so it's that where we can get seduced into trying to make it a bit better. So a couple of terms I would also ask us to think about that can be part of these this intersection of transference and countertransference. One is Ken Doka's term called disenfranchised grief. And it's when your grieving doesn't fit in with the larger society's attitude about dealing with death and loss. Example is how easy is it with even friends to say that your son has completed a suicide? How easy is it for you to talk about the overdose of your grandchild, as I had to do? My 23-year-old grandson died of an overdose at age 23. Well, for 6 to 7 years before that, he was never able to cross over from the using life to the sober life in spite of 3 treatment programs, in spite of all kinds of family interventions. And so there was a kind of no talk rule about that. Think about our no talk about sex, about grief, about religion, about some of these subjects. And so that's what we call disenfranchised grief. Are people allowed to talk about it? And then Tashio Bordera at the University of Missouri, Columbia, deals with situations in which she calls suffocated grief. And that the grief is there, but it's not only just unacknowledged, that's the disenfranchisement, but it's also punished. And she says it's especially true that children often have their grief suffocated, especially in a classroom setting. That we want them to wipe the tears, get back to normal, begin to do their work, and we began to push them in that way. I noticed this in the care of my mom as she moved further and further into the fog of Alzheimer's. Workers or her own family wouldn't allow her to grieve because we knew that she was having a tough time already with the dementia, and so didn't want to do anything that would cause her to be sad. And yet we were trying to talk her out of something, and that must have added to the craziness of the situation. It's what we call suffocated grief, where you get punished if you began to describe it in that way. And so all of these ways in which we can move toward imposing our standards on others. So some potential losses for you when the professional becomes personal. One is your therapeutic role, your identity. Have you become more friendly? Or are you a friend, a neighbor? Think about those of you who work in rural situations. You may be wearing several hats. Your children, your grandchildren are in the same schools. You attend the same church or local community college. You are active politically in your neighborhood, and yet you also happen to be an aging worker. And so do you need to put on a different hat and say, I'm now wearing my counselor hat. I'm wearing my nursing cap. We need to announce who we are and what our roles are. To realize that if these get altered in any way, these kind of roles that we have, it's what we call scope of practice. and it can be altered as the client becomes more preoccupied with your own story than with their story. If they see that the worker, I know a lot about that in my own life. Oh, that's hard for me to talk about. They begin to put their work over on the shelf because they want to take care of you. So it's called scope of practice. The continuity of care, does that get interrupted because they're concerned about you? The ways of working may be altered for the better or for the worse. And if you go too far, you could lose your license. Being friendly does not mean that you're now friends. You can be amicable, but you're not necessarily friends if you've got a professional relationship. The perception that you cannot relate to clients' lives if you avoid these subjects, that they see you as so distant that they don't share their real stuff with you. Or do you lose some authority, that you can gain? It's going to be trouble for you to gain back. Well, we've had a few slides here. I'm going to move you into a group, or Gavin's going to do that with you in just a moment. What I want you to do in the group, I'm going to give you about 12 minutes to share with others one example of something that can get to you, that you know can trigger you. You know your own history that relates to being bullied in childhood. It relates to some issues of addiction in your childhood. It relates to having people in your life who had a mental illness. It had people who made too many red marks on your paper. Think about things that can trigger you, people who use too many cuss words and so on. And then if you will, share those, and then also share one tool you use when you are triggered. So Gavin, if you'll move people into the groups, and then we'll monitor the time, and we'll go about 12 minutes and then come back and discuss that for just a bit.
Also invite folks to turn their cameras on when you're in the group as well, please.
That, okay.
Takes just a few moments if you are wondering what's happening. He's just moving people into the groups now, and you should begin to slide over. And it would be helpful if you are willing to turn on your cameras.
I believe I have the breakout rooms set up correctly. Okay, yeah.
Okay, and go ahead in one if you would like, Gavin, and I'll try to manage the time.
Yeah, I have it set up 12 minutes here, but why are these not?
Okay, yeah, leave that on, and then I'll take note of it.
It looks like the Cheryl is yet to join us, so the interpreters are just going to stay in the main room.
Okay, all right.
Is anyone who is in this the main room here having issues getting into a breakout room? All right. Well, I believe I am going to join a room here, Ted, and I will see you in probably 11 minutes or so.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Welcome back. I hope that was a good time for you to work with a few colleagues in a small way of simply naming some things that can trigger you. Why did I ask you to do that? Ask you to do that because if something's unmentionable, it's also unmanageable. So wasn't asking you to solve it that time or for others to fix or rescue you, but simply to name something that can trigger you. And by the naming, then that puts it out in front of us so that we know that it might need our attention. And then if you will, hold on to one tool you use when triggered, because after a break in just a bit, we're going to move toward responding and look at a number of tools that we can use. And so it's going to be a rich part of the session today. And so if you hold on to any of the things that were discussed about tools that one can use when triggered, that will be beneficial to everybody. And we'll do some sharing of that as we go forward. So let's look at some signs of quality carers. It's a British term. They don't use the word helper because helper often seems like it is hierarchical, whereas caring seems like it's a bit more lateral. And so these are the signs of effective carers and relationships. Self-awareness, that's part of what I was asking you to be aware of. Human presence, the body, not only the body shows up, but the person as well. They're not distracted. They're not doing other things. They're not multitasking. They're there with you. And then the intersection of empathy for yourself as well as with others, respect, authenticity, flexibility, mutual participation, a number of those kind of signs. Here's an example. In this case, it's a woman who is living with bipolar conditions, manic depressive episodes in her life. And so she's meeting, in this case, with a psychiatrist. The debt I owe my psychiatrist is beyond description. I remember sitting in his office 100 times during those grim months, and each time thinking, what on earth can he say that will make me feel better or keep me alive? Well, there was anything he could say. That's the funny thing, but it was all the stupid, desperately optimistic, condescending things he didn't say, what I call Minnesota cheer up, to keep me alive. All the compassion and warmth I felt from him that could not have been said, that he simply was direct, terribly important, and willing to admit the limits of his understanding and treatments. Most difficult to put into words, but in many ways, the essence of everything. He taught me that the road from suicide to life is cold and colder still, but with steely effort and an inevitable break in the weather, and with his help, I could make it. So he's not fixing, he's not rescuing, but he's sitting with her on her a bench of distress, of loss, of mental illness, and trying to help her to live with it as well as she can. So what we're speaking about is what Virginia Satir calls self-awareness. The more we're aware of our stuff, our triggers, the less likely we're to be surprised at those and to know what we needed. Again, I'll give you just a couple of examples. This is from a mom whose daughter is living with one of the eating disorders, and it's called kindness. It was not messages of hope and encouragement that sowed themselves most deeply, nor rallying cries, pep talks, certainty of facts. Rather, it was the expert who said she didn't have the answers and allowed for quiet. It was the friend who looked you in the eye with more than a blink or two as if to say, come in. It was hands held out unexpectedly when you were falling. It was wisdom served simply like good food. It was all these and something so ordinary you almost missed it. So what she just wanted was kindness and presence from people. Can we do that? Or do we always have to move toward kind of rescue and fixing it? So what can compromise? Let's see, let me back up one, I'm sorry. Do we call this personal work or professional work when you are doing aging services work? Personal work, no, this is professional work. Our professional work is with seriously challenged clients and that are extremely personal in nature. We're profoundly influenced by our clients and their families as much as they are impacted by us, and our emotional responses do impact the clinical moment, whether we want them to or not, whether we even are aware of them or not, whether we can admit it or not. And so can we say, I hope you never say to someone, I know exactly what you're talking about, because you have no clue what someone else is living through. Rather, what I would urge you to say that I think is said by Phyllis Katz in this piece from Professionals Weep is, I can relate to your story because I've had a similar story in my life. Tell me more of your story. Tell me about this, tell me about that. And so you're being professional, you're being solid, you're being compassionate, but you are not allowing them to move the caring role over to take care of you. Rather, you are still taking care of them. Nor are you falsely saying, I know exactly what you mean. Because none of us, even with intimates, know exactly what someone else means at a given time. So what can compromise your ability to do good work? What are our messages that inform whether or not you share personal stories with clients? Do you know the triggers? What from your life can compromise your work on a given day? What if you've just had a row with your children overnight? What if someone is going to hospital that day? What if there's too much month at the end of your money? Too little money at the end of your month, that kind of thing. What's the best and worst can happen if you share your own accounts of loss? Do you have go-to persons that will give you honest feedback about sharing your stuff with clients? That's what we're going to try to do today. So it's all of this that's part of what we're looking at. So a couple of definitions of countertransference. Countertransference, according to Costello, it doesn't announce its arrival, it sneaks in and becomes part of the therapeutic relationship. Although it is certainly preferable to catch it before it manifests itself, we have to expect that we will most often discover countertransference after it has arrived. That's the surprise, that we feel something going on in our body. We began to get a dry throat. We began to wonder, oh my gosh, I'm having flashbacks of my uncle, or on and on and on. All of the stuff that can be part of these kind of connections. Here's simply another definition, and look at the scheme at the bottom there. Countertransference is a natural phenomena. It's not that you are not mature. It's not that you're not professional. It begins with emotional reactions that arise within ourselves as a result of interactions with others. I would say it can begin even earlier inside our body, that we don't even have the emotional words for it, but we begin to feel that dry throat or the weight on our shoulder blades. And so it's all those as we begin to interact with others. And so it's these responses, if driven by forces beyond our conscious awareness, that's the countertransference, that can either help or hinder our efforts to provide compassionate, effective care. So if you get triggered, look at the scheme at the bottom, you may need to say, let me just take a breath. What you just shared with me seems very personal for you. It's also personal. I've heard these stories before. I even know something about this in my own life. Would you say that again? You're not admitting your own story. You're not moving it to your story, but you're saying, we both are getting triggered. Let's talk a little bit about this. And so what do we do at moments like that? We set boundaries. And boundaries are the limits that allow for a safe connection based on the participant's need, the client, the patient, the community citizen, and so on. When these lines are altered, what I was talking about earlier, if you are in a small community and you wear many hats with some of your neighbors and also wear a professional hat, you may need to even have a hat that you put on at moments to say, today I'm a nurse. Today I'm your chaplain. Today I'm your counselor. Today I'm the school principal. So you're not simply the neighbor at that moment and so on. When these limits are altered, what is allowed in the relationship becomes ambiguous. Such ambiguity is often experienced as an intrusion into the sphere of safety. And so you may even have someone that you know quite well say, you're not going to blab this to others, are you? Are you going to talk about this with your team? So you may need, again, to talk about what are the rules in your agency, because you may share some things with team to get your own support and advice, but there may be a way that you can keep that confidential. You don't have to name names. You don't have to give the address. You don't have to give away some identifying information, because you're setting that boundary so that they can go ahead with this. And then this slide, before let's make a decision about our next step. what I'm talking about, do you know the difference between what is yours and what is someone else's? What is mine and what is yours? Dennis Kloss leads a support group for bereaved parents. And he says, what the difference between mine and yours is bereaved parents have asked me why I continue to stay in the painful environment of this group. And then he rightly says, they did not choose to be there, but I did. So they're coming because they've got their own stuff. Their child has died recently or long past. Hopefully he's addressed that issue. There are some professional settings and some volunteer settings that ask someone who is a bereaved parent or even a bereaved person to not do the work for at least 6 months or a year so that they're not as raw. But hopefully Dennis has done his work and therefore he's choosing to be there. They are not. They're still dealing with being a bereft parent. And then I'm going to use a case study in just a bit, but look at this kind of summary. It is not an uncommon problem in the helping professions to blur the boundaries between what is mine and what is yours. One important way to prevent this is by recognizing the difference between what is your pain and someone else's pain. Active listening is important when dealing with grief or with trauma or with these kinds of things. Okay, I'm going to pause here. I've got a case study from that same book, but I think because of the noon to 1 o'clock hour, I'm going to move in just a moment to take a break. So I'm going to move away from the screen sharing and just see if there are any questions you have before we take a 10-minute break. And then I'm going to come back and do the case study with you. I think that might be wise because some of you might not have gotten your lunch, others might have. So if you want to put on your video, that would help, but you don't have to. But if you would just either unmute, we're a group only of 15, 16 people. If you'll unmute or put something in the chat and Georgia will monitor that. Let's just take 5 to 7 minutes for questions about the first half before we take a break and then come back for the second half. Who has a question or a comment or even share something from the earlier small group of a tool that you use when triggered? Let's get more voices on the table before we take a break.
So in my group, I joined a little bit late, but we came up kind of a big trigger that we have is imposter syndrome. And personally, I think when I think of imposter syndrome and the way to kind of alleviate that trigger is just really taking a step back and a lot of reassurance on my part and feel like it's probably how everyone deals with it, but it's just something that came up in our group that I thought would be kind of applicable to this.
To be sure that I understand, the imposter is that you're wondering, why am I doing this? Why do they think I'm that wise? Oh my gosh, I'm an imposter. And so the response that I hear Gavin saying is that you need to do a bit self-talk and to be aware of your resourcefulness, to be aware of your training, to be aware of some of the things you've learned along the way, and to offer that. You're not there to rescue or to fix. You don't have full advice, but you can sit with them, as the story I shared earlier. Is that Gavin? Is that what you're saying about dealing with the imposter syndrome?
Yes, thank you, Ted.
Yeah, okay. I sometimes wonder that as a trainer, why did they invite me to do this training? Isn't there someone else? And then they asked me 5 or 6 times. Oh my gosh, that makes you really feel like an imposter. Okay, who's next?
Hi, this is Kimberly.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that I liked at the end, I kind of listened to what my group mates were saying and thought, wow, it's so simple, but we just don't do this enough, is just having open, candid conversations. So this example would have been bringing something to a work group and just saying, wow, we're hearing a lot of, the example was elder speak, talking down to clients. And just that open communication, we sometimes fear having that, especially maybe in a work setting. But But that just goes such a long way to just sit and talk about something, because a lot of times people, they just need to hear your side, where you're coming from, and then it can be a pretty simple fix at times. And then the other thing that I shared with my team not too long ago for a team meeting is I've been taking a big interest in my own like nervous system, and just understanding when I have like those triggered feelings or just an icky moment where I have to question myself, like, where is this coming from? What's it stemming from? What things can I do to calm that down? Maybe I'm just nervous. So that's just been like a new tool for myself.
Right. Thank you, Kimberly. What you're talking about at the front end, and Eleanor, I'll come to you in just a moment, is it reminds me of a children's hospice I worked with in England. And when they started, they began to have voluntary staff support sessions. So not staff supervision, not meetings, not dealing with time management, budgets, whatever. And they were there to have the open conversations that Kimberly was talking about. And it helped them to deal with the stuff that they were hearing from families, and had, in this case, a child with a life-limiting or life-threatening condition. And we need settings like that. And if it can't be done formally, I would urge you to set it up informally with 2 or 3 trusted people and say, here's what I'm doing with the imposter syndrome. Here's what I'm doing when there's this kind of talking down to elders, and help me out here. Am I overreacting? Am I underreacting? Give me some feedback about my disturbed tummy and so on. And that kind of open stuff. Thank you. Eleanor, you had your hand up.
Well, my example relates to when you talked about in your last segment about when somebody is talking to you and you say, oh, I can relate to that, but tell me more about your story. Well, I have learned when I was, I don't know, somewhere along the line, I learned that you say, you actually say, oh yeah, that happened to me. And then you talk about it. My friend told me that she didn't want me, she just wanted me to be there for her. And she thought she insulted me. And I said, no, that was a gift, because I thought you were supposed to talk about, so that person could, you'd show them that you can relate. And that's kind of how I think. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I was ever told that, but you know how sometimes you develop these habits.
Right.
And I really thought it was a gift from her, because I was going into my own story.
Sure.
And it's real. And that was on a personal level. It wasn't a professional level. I don't know that I would have done that if I was in a professional role.
Okay. Really
Interesting to me.
Yeah.
And it taught me a lot, and it happened recently. So what I said there was like, this really hit me. So thank you.
All of us, all the time. Yeah. The only comment I would make, Eleanor, is a bit of a timing issue. The spotlight had been on the other person, and you were hearing their story, and something got hooked in you, and you said, I can relate to that, and you began to share your story. So you took the spotlight away from the other person.
Yeah.
So that's the part I'm wanting you to hesitate and to be more patient. You can say, I can relate to that. I can share with you a little bit of that in a bit, but you were telling me your story, keep going. And so whether that's with a friend or a client, you want to keep the spotlight on them. Then it can be a gift later to share some of your own story. I've had people, let me even use an example, a visual example. If you're looking right now, if you look over my shoulder, you see the hat, the Easter hat there on the wall, and some photographs. That's the hat that my wife of 41 years wore on Easter Sunday each year for 41 years, and she died in July 2020. And so countertransference is always right there looking over my shoulder. And people will sometimes say, tell me about that thing behind you there. I said, okay, I will, before we leave today, I'll share it with you, but go ahead with your story right now. And so it's partly a timing issue, and when do we volunteer our stuff? And we're going to talk a bit more in the second half about the importance at times for us to be willing to share our stuff as a way to help people to share their own story, that self-disclosure can invite self-disclosure. Yeah, so thank you. maybe one more before we take a little break. A question or a comment or a gift?
Well, I'll dovetail on that. I was in a group with a couple folks here, and we talked, they do direct service, which I don't do, and talked about chemical dependency. And it was interesting, that was a trigger for each of them. But one felt like, you know, they really wanted to talk about it, and one felt like they never wanted to talk about it.
Yeah.
So how, you know, it was the same trigger, but the response was different.
Yeah.
And then I kind of had a little bit of a different trigger, but in general, like the tools to use is really the self-awareness and the time and space to acknowledge when you're triggered, or acknowledge that you had been triggered by something. And, you know, that's not always easy to do, to give yourself, it's that, you know, self-reflection and self-care, and it's an ongoing skill to practice.
Yeah. Well, just a comment about where people differ. Again, a suggestion, and I have the suggestion because it came out of an earlier experience for me, where I was asked by a team where two workers just serendipitously were returning to work after cancer experiences. And they asked me, so well, how do we welcome them back? How do we not make this the elephant in the room? How do we deal with these people who are returning from cancer experiences? And I said, have you talked with either of them? Oh, no, we ask you to help us out. Tell us what to do. And I said, I urge you to talk with each of them. And similar to Georgia's story, one person said, there's more to me than cancer in my life. I don't want to talk about it. The other person said, cancer is part of my life now. I live with it every day. And so I'm an open book. And so they wanted to be treated differently. And so part of the scheme that they put together was to treat them differently and let people know what each of them wanted. If the kind of situation that Georgia was describing happens in a staff meeting or a team meeting, we might say, it sounds as if it would be helpful to some of you to talk about addictive experiences. But Ted, you said that you don't want to talk about it. If you want to step aside for a few minutes, that's fine. Please do so. We'll call you back in 10 minutes, but we're going to have a 10-minute discussion with those who want to talk about addictive experiences. So give people an out if it's something that's just flooding them and they don't want to deal with some people don't want to deal with other people's stories because it's their dominant story and they don't want to get caught up in someone else's story. And so it's all these ways we try to listen to ourselves, which you said so well, Georgia, but also being attentive to what's going on in the group that we're working with. We'll take a breath, everyone. That's a lot so far, our first hour or 62 minutes or so. How about if we take 10 minutes? So use the toilets, get yourself another cup of coffee or water or whatever, walk around, just get away from the screen at least. And Gavin, can you put on a timer there and alert us or ring a bell? Let's see, I might even have a bell here. Okay, here we go. When you hear this, I want you to come on back, okay? All right, see you in 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back. I hope you got a good break. Perhaps even put something in your tummy, a liquid or something a bit more firm, and can make it for another 50 minutes or so. I think because our group is relatively small, 16, I'm going to just share the case study with all of us so that we get the benefit of everyone's wisdom. So if you'll listen to the case study and let's talk together about what's going on here, what you think about what one of the characters in the case study does with a team. Would you do the same? Would you do something differently? Let's just talk about the various issues of having to do with transference and countertransference. It has to do with this issue that we were naming before the break of what is yours and what is not. Now, the situation, I'm going to read it as is in this case, a medical center where children are being cared for, but transfer in your own head. What if this was a person or a place that specializes in Parkinson's, specializes in stroke care and dementia care, might even be done at a senior center, on and on. Think about the various venues in which you move that you can do the transfer in terms of the setting, but listen to the content. I had diagnosed and accompanied from diagnosis to death dozens of children, perhaps over 100, he said with great emotion. Each child was like my own child. Tears were filling his eyes. Everyone in the staff meeting was affected. As he spoke, I could hear sniffling and see people wiping away tears with sleeves or tissue. The speaker was Jacob, a physician who treated children with infectious diseases. He and his staff were interviewing me to do staff support with the team. He continued, speaking to the team, frequently the bereaved parents even comfort me. They look and they see how greatly I loved their child. I looked around the room and saw that everyone in the room was in tears, including Jacob, everyone except me. Inwardly churning, I waited. Jacob turned to me. He waited for my response. It was not long in coming. Leaning toward him, I said quietly, the only reason that you can say that each of these children was like your own child is because none of them was your own child. After a pause, I continued, you go home to your healthy children and you say you're bereaved like a parent who returns to the empty house, the empty bed, the empty chair at the table. They see their friends and siblings of their child grow older, feeling all the pain of no future, where so much future was planned. I waited for my words to sink in, shock registered on all their faces, and then listened to this assertive piece to the team. This reaction of yours is unacceptable, unethical, unprofessional, and if I accept your proposition to train your staff, it will not happen here again. Surprisingly, at the close of the interview, I was given the job. So it's the story of a consultant working with a team. It happens to be some Israeli clinical people working in that kind of setting. But let's talk about that a bit. Was that an overstatement? Was that an overreaction? Or what questions do you have about the case study so that we can have as rich a conversation as possible? Reactions or questions? Unmute and let's make this as rich for us as possible. How do we talk with our mates about transference and countertransference? What's mine and what's theirs? Anybody have a reaction to the case study?
Well, I could say that I wouldn't have had the same reaction without the first hour of today's session.
Go ahead, Doug. Do you want to say a little bit more? Yeah.
I mean, I was sensitized to transference.
Yeah.
I've thought about professional boundaries in the past, but I hadn't thought of it being so immediate. And when you have somebody in a position of authority like that, exhibiting that they've been triggered over and over, it does cause some suspicion.
Right. And they even confess that the parents are taking care of him. They love me for the way I love their children. Goes even further. That's part of his trigger, but he's taking in their care of him, which is classic countertransference. That if the client or the group or the family begins to take care, it's the same if someone begins to take care of the manager, the supervisor, the physician in terms of the hierarchy in medical settings, if they begin to take care of the physician instead of taking care of the nurses, and the aides, that's the issue. Thank you, Doug. Other comments to add to what Doug said?
I think for me, oftentimes that transference and countertransference is seen as a way to build relationship, right? To really think about building rapport with people, because in other non-caring relationships or in friendships, sometimes that vulnerability is what, you connect with for people. And so I think that it's just often misinterpreted. And even if you look at like supervisor and supervisee type relationships or whatever, there is that, it's a fine line between like caretaking and sharing pieces about yourself.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to show you some slides in just a moment about the difference, from my perspective, of the difference between empathy and compassion. And I think what both Doug and Georgia are sharing is that we often got kudos, we often got applause if we were empathic in a large way. That showed the big heart of the worker. That showed the empathy of the worker, and that we could identify with, and so on. And part of what we're raising today is to at least call that a wee bit into question. And I'll clarify that in just a moment with some slides. Other quick comments before I go to some of those definitions. Did you have any reaction? We often don't have people in Minnesota who are as blunt as this reaction of yours is unacceptable, unethical, unprofessional, and if I accept your proposition to train your staff, it will not happen here again. That's pretty blunt.
Yeah, I wouldn't imagine that's a thing you'd really hear quite often in Minnesota. People take offense to it.
Right, but part of what we're struggling with today is how transparent can I be? And so if she was going to work on what is mine and what is yours, I think she's wanting to put it out at the front end so that people buy, if they're going to buy her services as a consultant, as a trainer, as an advisor, that they know what they're buying. And so interestingly, they gave her the job. Let me go back to some screen sharing and give a couple of definitions, and let's continue this discussion. So we were talking about what is yours and what is mine. Then we had the case study. Let me go ahead here and look at what I was saying. Some of the differences for me, and you may differ with me. Let's even have a discussion about this. When you empathize, you can actually feel the despair that you witness in the client or patient, and you suffer along with them. It's that identification that's, I think, is the piece that we're trying to struggle with here today. Whereas some of the reading that I've done on compassion, when practicing compassion, you also are a witness to the client's despair or struggles, but you don't feel it as they feel it. You don't suffer along with them. Yes, your heart can be touched. You can relate to it because of your own past experiences, but your job there is to be a witness to and to be able to sit with and say, I can relate to this. It's the discussion that Eleanor and I were having a bit earlier. But we don't have to feel it completely. So that's one kind of distinction. Let's look at another from John O'Donohue. Compassion ultimately involves a quality of presence. So you're not distracted, you're fully there. The body and the person are fully there. That conveys stability and resilience. So you bring your better self, you bring all of your skills with you. And here comes the empathy with a balanced concern and heartfelt connection. So there's the empathy, but it's not the dominant piece. And so it is also the part that's important here at the end is not depleting or overwhelming to either person. But the client doesn't begin to take care of you, nor do you get flooded with your own stuff. You may be saying kind of a 30-second message inside, oh, I need to see my counselor too. And you're kind of giving yourself self-permission that I need to address this. I'm not going to address that here. I need to see my counselor. Here we go again, Ted. I often say that to myself. Oh, Ted, you need to work on that one. And so it's that kind of quick message, but this is not the place because I want to not be overwhelming to the other person. Wonder if you have questions or responses. I'm not going to go back to move away from the screens, but does anyone want to say anything about my distinction, my suggested distinction between empathy and compassion? I'd like to hear if you differ or if you agree to what causes you to agree, any comments. Let's just have a little debate about this if there is a debate.
There was one comment, a couple comments in the chat, but Jess noted that empathy versus compassion is kind of like observing versus absorbing.
Ah, I like that. Yeah. To
And,
observe, to be a full witness, to sit with, to be close there, listening attentively, but not absorbing. Who else was speaking?
I just want to make the comment that I don't think I've ever really distinctualized the difference between compassion and empathy before. I haven't really made that concrete division there in my thoughts.
Okay. Well, I would just urge you to, I start to say play with this. And what I mean by that is I don't mean to diminish it in terms of play. Children are very serious about their play. And so they use something and play with it, they work with it and so on. So I would just urge each of you to keep these two slides in particular there before you and see, do they fit? Do they wear well? Do they make some sense to you as you go forward and interact with individuals and families, even with teammates?
Yeah, I think that piece, I mean, there's a little bit to me of a negative connotation around empathy, which but I don't think of being empathic as being bad, but the distinction is like, at what point do you need to set up a boundary so it doesn't start to kind of affect you too much, right? So somebody else's problems or the world's problems, we can feel those, but we can't make it our own problem.
Yeah, that's the balance, concern, heartfelt connection. So I don't want to diminish the empathy. But the issue, what Georgia, I also hear you saying, Georgia, is if it really gets to me, the true full-fledged empathy, then I might need to excuse myself and say, I think you need a different worker. I'm not good for you right now. I'm aware I need to deal with this. And so we help them to find someone else because I'm getting flooded with my own stuff. I need to step
think
aside.
what I'm translating, because I'm not direct practice, and I know a few of other folks here are either in more administration or development work. So I'm curious how that transfers into more of like a managerial role, or how does this transfer? Because I can't, if you're a director of an organization, as I know some folks on here are, and if they're getting triggered, they can't just forward, your work is your work, and sometimes your staff is your staff. And so how do you can't transfer them like you transfer a client, or ideally you wouldn't want to. So I guess, can you speak to that a little bit?
I would invite others to, but a part of what I think of, Georgia, is that some managers have said, I have some thoughts about what you've shared with me, but that's not my particular skill set. We have people here who do EAP. We have people here who are working around team care. Can we invite one of them to meet with us as we continue discussing this? So trying to separate the managerial role around being the compassionate manager. So the compassion is there, and recognize that this employee, this coworker of mine, is in some way upset, has these thoughts, these feelings, this experience, but that's not my role as manager. And so there are others, and if you want me present, I would be glad to be there with you, so that you give the worker a message that this is not something that would be punitive in terms of my managerial role. I simply want to see you get the care, and I'm not the person to provide it. There's some other teams, I'm sure some of you can say, well, in a short team, a small team, the manager has to be both a manager and a compassionate listener, a kind of counselor. And so we may need to talk again about the wearing of hats and so on. Because I know some managers who've said, somehow this has got to be addressed. Otherwise, one of you is going to have to leave. We simply can't have this conflict go on, or we can't have, whatever is the disturbance. And it's being very transparent about that, but saying, I don't want it to go there. So let's talk about how this can be handled. An example from my own past was as a middle manager. This is back in the day when gay, lesbian, and bisexual and transgender people were being outed, and it was not something easily talked about in an agency that was trying to work with that. And a co-worker saw a fellow worker in a place that was gay identified and made some comments about it, and so outed someone who did not want to be outed. And the two of them were saying that they could not work with each other. He didn't want her around. She wanted to pull back into her mouth all that she had said and seen and so on. And so I tried to get a peer who could help them to talk with each other, because, and it was part of my role also to talk with each other to see if they could come to any resolution of that. And so trying to deal with the transferences that were going on. Let's go ahead. We can come back to all of this, because you're beginning to push us further into the depth of these matters, and they deserve our attention. I want to suggest, for those of you who are concerned about your own personal sharing, a tool that we've talked about when we especially did the session on narratives for elders. And it has to do with the use of prompts that may be one step away from you. It's what we call reauthoring lives. And look at the second piece from narrative therapist Michael White, that he perceived parallels in something he was reading in fiction and poetry that he saw in therapy. And so he asserted that engaging people in the therapeutic work is to help them to reauthor the compelling plights of their lives. And so here's an example. Reynolds Price was diagnosed with spinal cancer. And he said, when I finally recovered the will to read, I searched around me for any book, essay, or sentence that might speak directly to the hole I was in, anything more useful. And then he takes on the medical team, the crackpot guides to healing or death, starvation diets, alfalfa pills, karmic tune-ups, all the stuff he was being told to help himself with spinal cancer. I needed a story that paralleled at some distance my own unfolding bafflement, some honest report from someone else who had dealt with something like spinal cancer. And so it's what we call bibliotherapy, the use of prompts from song lyrics, from fiction, from poetry. And so it's not your own story, but it's using the stories that are there in print. But the potential misuses of bibliotherapy is the overuse of your own favorite readings instead of listening to the grieving person, or use of readings to manipulate a desired response instead of prompting the client to create responses from you. Naivety about culture, language, developmental maturity, or just to show off. So it's all of those are some of the dangers. But the proactive steps that can be taken when personal intrudes is to compartmentalize, to center yourself, to take a break. And then what I just described is to tell a story in a second-handed manner. I've heard people who, or I found this in a poem, or this song lyric seems to speak to what we were discussing last week. So you tell a story, but distinguish what is yours and what is the client's or someone else's. And find ways in which that can happen. I've done some of that, and you can be the judge yourself. Is this going too far? Let me give an example from the most recent book of mine that I've published that is called Ambiguous Parables. And here's a story about my mom with Alzheimer's. Do you think this would go too far in sharing my own story? When one says little. When one says little, twinkles, grimaces, nods, magnify, the little shown or said grows in memory and meaning. Whatever you can get is acceptable even when more is desired. Dementia has taken mom's vocabulary, Her stories and comments have shrunk to a word here, a phrase there, a frown or giggle, forcing me to listen and watch for any wrinkle or word. She was moving further and further into the fog. We hang on to words like, so good. Come closer. That hurt. Don't go. Interpreting each as if we could read the ever-changing, limited mind of Mom. He's looking at me was heard one day as she and a calendar dog engaged in a standoff of staring. She held her ground and gaze. Which blinked first is unknown. She was looking over my shoulder and this calendar dog was looking at me. She said, he's looking at me. I came to believe that she's still the teacher, reminding her sons, like the dog, to see her. She didn't say, look at me. She'd rarely been that direct. No, when that appeared, she lifted her slumped head, looked, paused, and said, oh, I'm glad you're here. Best phrase I'd heard that day. It mirrored what I believed to have been a deep yearning to be seen by dog or person, especially for those who can only say or know a little. So that's a written piece that I have written. I sometimes have shared it in elder care settings, in senior centers and various places as a prompt for someone to share their story. And it's a bit distant because it's on paper. It's been written down. And while it's personal, it's not as personal as if I was sharing it in a very intimate way. So some potential reasons for self-disclosure with clients. One is modeling. That would be one reason I might share that story, to give permission. As I shared with Eleanor earlier, stories invite stories, to break the ice, to lower the barrier between client and therapist. That's what she was trying to do, and she said she could relate to it. And even prompts for their own therapy. But we share our stories always in the interest in the growth and healing of the other person for that reason only. So again, what we do in terms of self-assessment is, when and for what reasons do you share that story? When and for what reasons do you not share your own story? What are the risks and rewards for self-disclosure? What's the worst that could happen if I share my story? What's the best that could happen? If self-disclosure invites self-disclosure, what's the downside? How do you select what to share, what not to share? One of my earlier slides says that you listen first for understanding, not for response. How do you protect your family and others crucial to your story? Some pieces that I've written, I've asked family members, are they okay if I share that without their names? What are the ethical guidelines for self-disclosure? So it's all of those that we're talking about. So just a couple more slides, and then we've got 20 minutes or so for discussion about all of this. Look at this dual process model around grief and stress work. It's the ability that we oscillate between these two circles, that we need times and places and venues and prompts to help us do the grieving work. And sometimes it's sharing some of our own stuff, or it's sharing something from a book or from song lyrics. But we also need times and places and venues and people with which to do restoration work, respite, resiliency promotion, moving forward. Not Minnesota cheer up. Look on the bright side. Oh, you can handle this. Oh, you'll get over this. It just takes time. That's false restoration. And so this is honest grieving work as well as honest restoration work. And we can help people with stories around doing that. So discerning where you are, what I would urge is, do not share your personal story of loss if you're spending most of your time each day for yourself on the grieving side of the dual process model. And then be cautious about further sharing of your account of loss after a previous use that was useful to another client, and now you want to share it with everybody. Remember, one experience of grieving is one experience of grieving. So I use those as my own filter. So why am I sharing this? Is this a good time? What's going on with me as I think about doing that? And so just in some ways to remind ourselves of the power of all of this is these quotes about stories. You don't have anything if you don't have the stories. And so people come to counselors, come to nurses, come to chaplains, come to senior centers because they want to share their stories. It's what we call reminiscence and life review. But stories and words are ambiguous. Someone might read what I rewrote and discover something there that I myself did not see, but which might be just as valid as my original thought. That's what's happening even with these slides. Some of you are embellishing. What was the earlier one? The difference between absorbing and observing, or what was it that was said? Just that was just a wonderful kind of phrase. I've got to get it written down. Help me remember it in just a moment. But if I tell my story anything like right, the chances are that you'll recognize it's also in many ways your story, because it's a human story. So that's the reason that we do this, but sometimes it can get us in trouble. So one more time to move away from screen sharing. Take another breath. That's it. That's all the slides I have. Let's spin this. Let's help each other. We've got 20 minutes or so before you turn into pumpkins. So let's get questions. Let's get resources. Let's get accounts of tools that you're using. Let's pretend that we're in the same room. We are. And let's share the wisdom. And let's even start. Who was it that said that? I want to write it down because I want to take it to my bank. What was it? Absorb? What's the other one?
Observing versus absorbing.
Observing. And who said that? Let's give credit where credit's due.
It's me.
All right, Jess, thank you. Can I use that anywhere? Do I have to give you credit?
No, I took it from one of my yoga guides. So
Okay, thank you. All right, questions, comments? Let's argue. Let's have a good debate about some of what I've tried to share today. Put it in the chat or unmute. We're only a few people, so probably easiest to unmute. What questions, comments, additions?
I wish I would have learned this like when I was in my 20s. I've always been a storyteller, and people have encouraged me to tell stories. And I think that's where I've gotten into trouble. It's that thing of when to tell your story and when not to. And I'm probably not as interesting as I think I am in my own head when I'm telling those stories. And I hate to admit it to a room full of people I don't really know. I think I'm learning an important lesson here of, just, and it's just really important about just really being, compassionate is about really being there.
Yeah.
You don't have to solve anything. You don't have to, all you have to do is be there.
Yeah.
And occasionally it might be okay to say, I can relate to that. But, for me, I think it's important to be mindful of my own desire,
Right.
of my own story.
Yeah.
And really do those. I like those things, about how to is this the right time? Where am I at in my own head? What's going on here? Because you can just be itching to tell a story like, oh.
Yeah.
And that's probably more about, it's more about you or, than it is about what's going on in the room.
Right. And there's a time and place for stories. I'm guessing you have a strong skill set of stories, but what I'm trying to raise is not that you don't tell stories,
Right.
but for what reason, for what purpose? And the part I put in that doesn't match what you said about that maybe the stories aren't as good as I think they are. They probably are quite good, but sometimes we use them a little bit to show off. Certainly I've done that at times. And so that's when I feel regretful that I did it for the wrong reason. And the timing was there. Yeah, thank you for your transparency. Remember, we started with some issues around self-awareness. The more self-aware that we are, not only about our stuff, but also the ways that we try to help, that we try to be there for others. Are they always beneficial to the receiver? Are they serving our own tendencies and so on? So you're calling all of us on our stuff of our tendencies. some people, instead of open questions, interrogate clients. So that, it's that kind of thing. How am I using my open questions? So it's just another version. Jess, again, your hand's up.
Yeah, I was just thinking it's been a really important distinction for me when just dealing with like friends and family. I don't really work direct service, but when like people come to me for advice or just to talk, I start the conversation with, are you looking for somebody to just vent to or to listen, or would you like advice on this? And then that can kind of set the stage for
Okay.
our conversation.
Okay, did you hear her three choices there? I've heard those before. Do you want me just to listen today? Do you just need to offload? Do you just need to say it out loud? Do you want me to ask some questions? Or do you want some suggestions? And they may say, how about all of the above? Well, then you at least know that they're giving you that kind of carte blanche. But in some cases, people say, I think today I just need to say it. I'm struggling with what's going on. So let me just talk for a little bit. Or would you help me clarify some things? And so the questions. And so that's a lovely one. And it relates very much to the open question model, that we're inviting people so that we better understand them. We're not listening for response, but listening to understand. Okay. Other questions, tools, perspectives? What have you learned about your own care at moments like this?
Sort of piggybacking on what Jess said, one of my the things that kind of offset me that I said in my group earlier was that I have a hard time when a conversation steers heavily into the negative. And so I don't know, there's a group of directors and leaders that get together monthly with me, and one of the ground rules that they placed was turn venting into problem solving, and I really liked that because you can still talk about it, but rather than I hate this, I hate this, I hate this, it's this is challenging for me. What do you got for me? Do you guys have suggestions? And it's just a bit more productive that way, and it just more like feedback
Right.
than anger, or that venting can turn negative so easily.
Let me even give you an additional perspective, Kimberly. Appreciate what you're saying. But in the earlier session that I did on talking about tough stuff, I talked about appreciative inquiry. And some colleagues at Case Western University in Cleveland began to look at, even if you do problem solving well, it's a reactive model because you start with the problem. And what they began to create was this appreciative inquiry. Take a situation, a case study, or whatever, and let's think together about when that was handled well.
Yeah.
Who said what? Who did what? What happened that caused that to be a conflict handled well? A situation that was quite tragic that was handled well. Something that was very, very difficult but handled well, small or large, and what could be adapted that would cause that to be appreciative inquiry, that we're using some of the tools, the strengths that we had for a past experience, might not have them in depth that we need them for this current, something that's overwhelming. I think about the pandemic. Lots of the tools that we had were not adequate for a 2-year plus experience. And so we needed to talk about what did we use at earlier times in crisis that are adaptable for an endemic, not just a pandemic, but an endemic, something that goes on and on, the kind of situations that lots of elders are living with, of a chronic condition that's not going to get better. And so it's not that we're going to cure, but how do we help people to live with something that's ongoing? And so the appreciative inquiry is that we start with any moments from our past that are teaching moments about something similar to that, that has some components of that was handled well. Who said what? Who did what? How was that done well? And then can that be applied then to this situation? Because the problem solving can be negative itself because it's reactive.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of the theme of like the psychological safety of like, I feel like with COVID, groups are starting to feel a little bit more okay with talking about personal feelings. And so like we're getting better habits in groups, in larger groups, where we feel a little bit more comfortable and confident speaking about tough things. We
Right.
have that safety to question, like just for you to be able to ask someone that. I think it would take me a while to think of even asking that, because I come from a work culture that unfortunately didn't have a lot of that psychological safety where I was able to bring more up or go deeper. So I like how all of that into me weaves together with just like openness and safety and honesty and genuine thoughts and things like that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Who's next with a comment? I think what some of you are talking about are things that you want to take home, that you're learning here today, that you're thinking about. That's important. Some of you have been with me before know that unless we begin to think about what have I learned today that's useful to me and take it home with me, it'll get lost in 3 hours or 3 days because we get busy with stuff. And then it gets, it's the reason I wanted to get my note about absorbing and observing so that I don't lose it. So what are some of the take homes that each of us have? We might even share that with each other in just a few minutes, but let's get, are there other questions, comments, wisdom, or something that you've done when triggered that would be useful to the rest of us?
It's a comment, and not necessarily about being triggered, but it more ties in with the whole problem solving thing. I see this more in my personal than professional life, but when people are venting to you about a problem or some issue that arises, it took me a while to realize that I am not obligated to extending my energy to try and fit the puzzle pieces of a middle ground or a solution together. And sometimes it's better just let other people deal with that problem and kind of stepping back from it and not having to feel as if a mediator position.
Right, right. And it sounds like you're suggesting, Gavin, that you might, even with intimates in your life, family members I'm thinking of, or close work colleagues, to say, hold it, time out. I'm having trouble listening to you because I think we have some differences right now. You might want to find someone else. This is not good for me to absorb that right at this moment. Sometime I'd like for us to talk about some positive ways we could move forward, but today's not a good day for that. It's what we mean by boundaries, that at times, and especially when we've had such a divisive time around mask wearing, around safety, about what's real, what's not, fake news. Just to hear someone go on with their particular vantage point may be important, but am I the right person to hear that? And can I hear it well right now? And if the relationship is important to me, I may set a boundary so that I'm trying to keep the relationship going rather than to simply get myself in lots of distress and agitation because of what they're saying. Because lots of people, I may be getting close to being on a soapbox myself, but lots of people have been doing more preparing of their 2 cents worth rather than having a dialogue. It's almost as if we're speaking to one another rather than talking and listening to one another. And so if someone is speaking to me about their particular political or the safety issues around the pandemic, I may just say, this is not a good day for me to hear that. I'm going to set a limit here. Other questions, comments? Georgia's just let us know that she had to step away, but we'll perhaps be back. we're going to take a minute at the end about some evaluation from Gavin, but we've got a few minutes if you have another question or comment. Well, I wonder if you will, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but would you be willing to share with one another one simple take-home thing? It may be something you already knew and it simply got reinforced today. It may be something that's a bit new for you, but if I can move around the room and just ask you to share just very briefly so that we all can hear it, and then I'll turn to Gavin for evaluation. Just any kind of take-home that you got from today's session. Eleanor, can I put you on the spot to start?
Oh, sure. Let me go first. Well, the reason I say that is because I think it's like I'm seeing some shortcomings of my own, and I'm grateful for that. But I definitely feel like today has opened my eyes about some things I want to work on for myself and in my relationships with other, because I think the thing too is the relationship is more important often than my opinion or my soapbox or my whatever.
Okay, all right, thank you. Megan, would you go next? Each of you will unmute as I call on you. You're still muted. Oh, there
Yeah,
you
it
go.
takes me a little bit to fix it with my headset on, but
All right.
yeah, no, you're good. I would say, like, for the most part, it's just been a really good reminder of the importance of transference and countertransference. Like, I think it's something that you talk a lot about in your education, and you sometimes get to see it in your practice, but it's a nice reminder to think like, okay, what has been a more recent example that I've experienced in the last, let's say, couple weeks that I can reflect on. Especially since I'm not necessarily in a counseling role, more in a service connected sort of role, but that happens all the time because I'm hearing narratives every day.
Right.
So yeah. Thank you.
Ashley, what is a take home for you?
This whole session has just really got me thinking about a lot of things and the importance of setting those boundaries and not taking on, like you said, things that aren't your problem. I'm such a problem solver. That's our role, to help come up with solutions. And sometimes people just need you to listen and, like you said, have that compassion and that's okay. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Sonia, there a take home for you?
Well, yeah, well, I think the compassion versus the empathy, that I can be a good listener and be compassionate and caring, but again, I don't have to absorb all of the feelings that they're sharing with me. And then just that self-awareness, knowing what my triggers are, when I'm talking with somebody or they're sharing their story and I can feel myself, my cheeks getting red, or I instantly start to sweat, or whatever, knowing those internal triggers. So
right. Yeah.
Don't
yeah. Sometimes our bodies talk first. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a very good comments and good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Wendy, what are you going to take home?
It's a combination of when we were in the small groups, just recognizing maybe we don't have just one trigger, maybe we have several. And we just don't always, because we're put on our professional face every day, just really looking in terms, well, do I have more than one trigger? And yes, I can say that I do, but they each affect me a little bit different. And maybe the reflection of that is how I present the situation or continue helping somebody with my own triggers. So just having that awareness.
Yeah, there are many triggers. Wow. Yeah. Douglas, what are you going to take home?
I think maybe that last point got me most intrigued about problem solving being reactive. And I think that relates to how I would relate with staff as well. Just, are we always problem solving, or are we trying to really relate from a human perspective?
Okay, all right. If any of you want the appreciative inquiry model, shoot me an email and I'll send you some materials about it. So Jess, what are you going to take home?
I am more aware of, the triggers and how they show up in my personal and professional life, I guess. Like I said earlier, I'm not really a direct service role, but knowing what the triggers are for when I am going to be working with the community more in the future, and having tough conversations, which is going to be a part of my role, and knowing what brings that up in me and how to deal with it and how to appropriately respond.
That's self-awareness. Yeah. Deb, what about you?
Well, I have a couple of them. I like, and I've heard it before in some of the previous sessions, but the listen to understand and not respond. I think that for me, I can never hear that one too much, because I'm always about fixing things and problem solving and strategizing. And so it's like, I should have that tattooed on my forehead. And then the other thing that I like is being able to, that self-awareness of, can I hear this well right now? I think that that's really important for me to be able to recognize that, and maybe that, to set that boundary and that limit is, and recognize that maybe this isn't the time to have this conversation with me, that, whatever is happening in my world is just doesn't put me in the best place to receive information or to make decisions or things like that. And so I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Kimberly, if you can be brief, some people are having to peel off because of 2 o'clock, and I want you to hear about Gavin's evaluation, but what are you taking home, Kimberly?
Yeah, I think just the fact that everybody has different triggers, and just to I'll just keep reminding myself that when I'm in a space and things might be awkward or whatever it is, that I just have to think more about myself and everyone else at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Gavin, tell us about this evaluation tool that's going to come their way, and thanks to you and Georgia and Linnell and others for setting this up today.
Yeah, so I just created a brief survey before this event. I'll post the link in the chat here really quick, along with my email, and you can email me if you want a copy of the PowerPoint slides and any other notes that Ted may have taken during this presentation. I will be sending these out at a later time, so you don't have to rush and do them right away, but you can expect to also have this information at probably an hour or so.
Okay.
So. And I did just want to say what my main takeaway was too. Spotlights on me for a little bit, but so my main takeaway was that I'm still fairly new in my professional role here, and this kind of gave me a readiness for the eventuality when I will have to have a sense of transference in my professional relationships.
Okay, thank you. Glad that happened. Georgia, welcome back. Thanks for all your organization of this. Do you want to say any final word as we head off?
Oh, sorry, I had to step away. It was kind of one of those calls that just needed to take. But I appreciate everybody jumping on. I guess one of my takeaways, and this is always a need, but that piece around the triggers and knowing when you're being triggered, right? I think that's just has really stuck with me today. So in knowing that you can actually do something when you are triggered. Yeah. So that was good. And I really appreciate Ted having the slides and the great information that you bring.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Good wishes to you. Hope to see you again. Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh, are we just, all right. Oh, cancel that.